I was thinking of old days in Jasper this morning. It's funny how your mind goes back and stays and you don't realize it's there, and you are planning things with your conscious mind and sometimes even reading a book, and yet this old memory is like a ghost just flitting around from the big camphor bush to which was really a tree, not a bush, to the banana shrub, on to the big oak tree and the magnolia and so on. And suddenly I saw two little feet, and one of them was mine and one was Marjorie's, and they were wiggling up and down in the sand. And each of us was digging a hole with our hands, but we were also half digging with our toes and making what is called a toad frog house. And we dig and dig and dig, and that is strange land, soil down there in North Florida. If you dig 12 or 14 inches, you always come to very wet earth, and sometimes even at 6 inches you do. So it's wonderful to play with. And there we were digging away, and these little toes just flipping and flapping up and down. And we made a hole, and then we took the dirt and dried it out with some dry sand and built it all around our foot. In other words, we used our foot as an armature, each of us, and built up this house that was actually more like a little Eskimo house than anything I can think of. But this was our way of building what we call toad frog houses. And then after it had dried a little bit around our feet, we'd slip the feet out, and there would be this nice, mysterious, dark, hollow place inside. And then that night we were sure a toad frog would come. And I don't know why we call them toad frog. We didn't say frog and we didn't say toad. We said toad frog. Somehow that made it more important and more mysterious, too. And then we'd look inside, hoping to see two little glistening eyes staring back at us next morning. But it's a wonder we didn't find the little snake staring back at us instead, but we didn't. And Marjorie and I would play like that by the hour, or stringing red seeds out of the magnolias. After the petals have fallen, there is something that looks almost like a pine cone. I suppose you'd call it a magnolia cone. And it has these beautiful, beautiful, clear red seeds in them. I don't know whether you actually call them seeds. I think so. And we'd string them and wear them around our necks. But Marjorie and I did things more important than stringing magnolia seeds together and making toad frog houses and climbing the great trees around us. We told each other stories. And for years I thought we actually told each other stories. I didn't know that I told the story. And Marjorie was that important person, the listener. And in that way we made the story together. But that came as a surprise to me, although of course I had learned it the hard way as a writer, that a book is nothing until you find the reader who can listen and really hear everything you're saying in the book. And most readers hear very little of what you're saying. But Marjorie was apparently the perfect listener. And when I was 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years old, according to her memory, and mine to a more dim extent, I told the long stories, and she listened. And in that way we collaborated. What these stories were about, neither one of us can remember for the life of us today. I think they were about a world that was better, though, than the one we had. And, of course, we had an enormously good world compared to most children, full of fun and full of things and full of comforts. But each of us was growing the hard way. And there were times when we were furious with our families and with our sisters and brothers and with everybody but each other. I don't remember that we ever got furious with each other. And we were friends from the time we were 4 years old until she left Jasper at 15. Then I left there at 17. And since then we have seen almost nothing of each other. But coming back to these stories, apparently she and I would walk down the railroad track, walking the rails, falling off, stopping to pick wild flowers, violets, irises. The irises grew down there by the thousands in the ditches along every railroad track and along every path and road. And we'd be stooping, picking flowers, and here I would be going on and on and on with this continued story, which I don't think stopped at the end of our play day, but was picked up the next time we were together. And yet neither of us remembers very much about it, except she said that she was always just almost hypnotized by it. And I think it was because it was her story too. And I think I rather remembered her as collaborating, I would say, more actively than just listening, because it was her story. I was telling the story of two little girls who loved each other very much and yet who were lonely children, somehow with physical comforts and surrounded by big families, and yet each of us cut away from those families by our fantasy life, I suppose, and our dreams. Anyway, it was like that. And I've often thought of it since then, this collaboration of the dream, how no one, no writer, no painter, no sculptor, no musician either, can perfect his dream or even carry it out or create it in full until there is a listener or a looker to collaborate with him. And how we find these dreamers who can collaborate with us is a strange and wondrous and magic sort of thing. I don't know how we find them. We never know. I write a book, say a book like Strange Fruit, and it sold into the millions. And I would say that maybe, just maybe, not more than 50,000 of its readers really collaborated with me as listeners on that book. They thought that book was about something it wasn't about. They had heard these fantastic tales of how scandalous it was and how obscene and how controversial, and that it was written to help Negroes, and so on and so on and so on. So all kinds of people came to the book to read it, and it was almost as if they were deaf and blind because they never saw what the book really was about. They had already created a book in their minds before they picked up my book, and my book was just, a hunk of pages of paper to them, and they whiffed over those pages, never really knowing what they were reading, never listening, because there's so much more to a book than the printed words on that white paper, so much more. Every word casts a shadow, and every word makes an echo, and sometimes a word casts 10 shadows, and sometimes it makes 10 echoes. And a good listener, a good looker, will get all of this. And when he does, or when she does, the collaborator has been born that the writer needs. But if that doesn't happen, then your book has been read by a deaf and blind person, and he has gotten only the sounds that he had already heard from gossip and in book reviews and newspapers and so on, and he never knows what your book is about. And that leaves you feeling very sad and lonely. And that is the way I felt as a very grown-up, sophisticated person when Strange Fruit was published and not read, but bought and the pages turned by millions of people. Some of them were looking for a four-letter word, as though they couldn't find four-letter words scrawled on the sidewalk or in latrines or restrooms and so on. There was a four-letter word, one, in the entire book, if I remember rightly, if we are using that word to mean something that has to do with the body and sex. It's something so pitiable to me about the hunger of many, especially Anglo-Saxon people, but Western people, who were restricted by Puritanism from really understanding the hungers and needs of the human body. This is another form of segregation, which has always seemed to me even more important than racial segregation, in that we have segregated the body into evil and good parts, into dark and light. And there are some things about the body that we think of as being sinful and wrong, where nothing could possibly be sinful and wrong about the body. Well, anyway, as I thought about Strange Fruit, I remembered Marjorie, the little listener who did collaborate with my dreams, and because her heart was lonely for what my heart was lonely for, her mind was very keen, and I think mine was, and she could reach out and understand my vocabulary and what I was trying to say, even as a small child. So we did have that beautiful collaboration, and it was the strongest part of our friendship. It was an enormously rich and creative friendship for two little girls to have had. There was nothing nasty or mischievous about it. It was a very natural thing. It was tremendously mental and spiritual, and also it was physical. We loved to play the same games. We adored not so much group play as we did what you would call lonely play. Each of us liked to dance around. Each of us loved to do acrobatic things, and we were always risking our cracked skull by doing wild and awful things on the high limbs of the trees, and then daring each other to try it too. And we'd climb as high as we could and get out on little tiny limbs where we were really dizzy, and we wouldn't admit our dizziness, daring the other one to do the same. Then sometimes we'd climb out of the window of her grandmother's house, a big, big house, and creep over to a very giant-sized chinaberry tree whose limbs overhung the roof. And then we'd swing up to those limbs and get on, and then keep climbing. And there were tree houses and all the big oak trees and chinaberry trees, and we'd play in those. And we both read at the same time, but not the same book. I would go over to spend the day with her, and we'd read all day long. She would read one book, and I would read a book. And we were having another community of the daydream there, in that we each knew the book that the other one was reading, and had we not already read it, we were going to read it immediately when the other one finished with it. And therefore our reading was shared in that on a deep level, just as my storytelling was shared with her. This collaboration of the dream is such a strange, strange kind of thing. And yet there'd be no art without it. And without art, I can't imagine there being such a thing as the human being, the person. We think of many important things to being a person, and we tend in this political age we live in to think about our civil rights and our so-called human rights. But in a way, the most important human right we have, I think, should be the freedom to collaborate in each other's dreams. And that means the freedom to look at a painting and see there what we want to see. And sometimes the critic tries to keep us from seeing what we want to see.